Ladies and gentlemen, this is Kelly Runner-Singer, Senior Program Attorney at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Today is a wonderful day for a webinar. Welcome to Domestic Violence in Transgender Communities, put on by the National Council. You might notice that we've had a slight faculty change. Unfortunately, Judge Victoria Kolakowski was unable to make it today, so we have Professor Todd Brower, the Director of Judicial Education at the Williams Institute in California, and we also have one of our senior NJIDV faculty, Judge Elizabeth Berns from King County, Washington. I'm delighted to have everyone here today. Now, you might notice at the bottom of your screen you have a chat box, and the cool thing about that is that while this webinar is going on, you can also pose questions to our faculty. I'll be writing these questions down, and at several stopping points throughout the presentation, I can read them back to our faculty so that they can respond to you. Thank you so much, and please introduce yourself, and I'm going to turn it over to our two faculty members.
Okay, hello, this is Todd Brower from the Williams Institute. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for joining us on this program.
And this is Elizabeth Berns. I'm a judge in King County, Washington, which is in Seattle, Washington, and I'm equally as delighted to be co-presenting with Professor Brower and also to be sharing information with all of you that are calling in this morning and this afternoon.
All right. So the first thing we're going to do is see a short clip from actually a short film. It's a Danish film, but there are subtitles. And what we'd like you to do is watch it and see what happens, and we'll talk a little bit about it.
The audio for the the audio for the video will only play over your computer speakers, so if anyone is listening in over their phone, if you could just mute your phone and turn up your computer speakers while the video is playing, that would be great.
Simon, er jeg en dårlig mor?
Vi bliver nødt til at gå ud til de andre også.
Jeg spurgte dig om noget. Er jeg en dårlig mor?
Ja.
Det gik da meget godt. Jeg tænker på, hvor længe siden det er, vi har været sammen med alle sammen. Hvad siger du til, at vi tager ud og rejser lidt? Kunne det ikke være rart? Du har været så forvirret det sidste stykke tid. Kunne jo også få styr på alle de tanker, der foregår inde i dit hoved.
Mor, hvad er det seriøst, du ikke forstår? Jeg har født i en forkerte krop. Det hjælper sgu da ikke. Noget med en eller anden lorteferie.
Forstår ikke det her, Emilie?
Jeg har født i en forkerte
krop. Er det mig, du prøver på at straffe? Ved du hvad? Vi kan også bare droppe den ferie, vi kan. Men du har brug for hjælp. Du driver mig simpelthen til vandet. Jeg ved ikke, hvad jeg skal stille op med det her.
Hvad snakker du om, mand? Jeg driver dig til vandet. Det skulle da mig, der er ved at blive fucking sindssyg. Alle de her julefrokoster, hvad fanden det er. Det er sgu da ikke mig, for helvede. Jeg må ikke gerne ikke mere. Du skal lade mig bære, seriøst.
Det er jo bare hjælp, der skal.
Ja, men jeg er en dreng! Hvad laver du, mand? Ja, men jeg er en dreng!
Okay, so it looks like we had a little bit of a synchronization problem, and so I apologize to the Danish speakers who are going to hear that a little strangely. What I'd like to ask you about is some questions. So, and you can respond in the little text box, and we can do this. So the first question is, why does Simon, who is her brother, think that the mother is a bad mother? And actually, you can read all the questions there, so you can type things down there. There's a little bit of a lag. I see all these people are typing, so I'm really curious as to what the responses will be.
And just a little clue for when the full clip, you'll that Simon and basically both the two siblings have a very close relationship with each other.
Right. So I'm seeing the responses. I assume you can all read them too, but a number of people have mentioned the mother's non-acceptance of her child as a boy, or the mother's being self-centered and thinks that her son's transition has something to do with her. Another person mentions that there's a minimization of the issue, that it can be fixed by a vacation or something like that. The child's unhappy, she's not helping the child. And if you read the other questions, obviously these are all related in that sense. Why does the mother think Ellie is trying to punish her? She's viewing the gender issue as something that the mother, did wrong. And the mother resorts to violence because she does not know what else to say. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of how does this relate to domestic violence is that the sort of reaction that somehow this is a choice that someone who is transgender is making, and doing it sometimes to punish other people or whatever is a dynamic that can happen not only in this period of transition, but also as a technique of abuse and things of that nature. Punishment is a form to correct rather than to try and understand. So that sort of the use of physical violence in these situations, whether rooted in frustration, as the mother is, or rooted in something worse in that sense, is part of what we're going to be talking about. So we'll keep in mind these ideas as we go through the rest of the slides. So I wanted to start with an idea that I know that you've thought about, but I want to make it explicit, because when we talk about these issues, it's important to separate different concepts. So the way I think about it, and I offer it to you if it works, is the idea that there are 4 different continuums. Biological sex, that is to say the sex that you were assigned at birth, and a person could be assigned male or female or intersex or somewhere along that continuum, which is different from gender identity, which is the identity that an individual sees themselves as, which is man or woman or both, somewhere in that continuum, or perhaps neither, or gender fluid, something that can move on that continuum. Gender expression, which is a 3rd sort of dimension. That's how you present yourself, both to yourself, but also, more importantly, in some sense, to the outside world, the clothing that you have, the timbre of your voice, the way in which you interact with the world, which can be masculine or feminine or both or neither, and once again, it can be dynamic in terms of fluid. And lastly, sexual orientation, which just because you know some of those other things doesn't say that you know anything necessarily about the individual's sexual orientation, whether they're attracted to men or women, or both or neither, or attracted to other trans people, etc. And that if you think of these as distinct kinds of ways of sort of dynamics that appear for everybody, straight or gay or trans or non-trans or gender disparate or non-gender disparate, it sort of helps keep these things separate. So with that, let me turn it over to Judge Berns for a second.
Thank you, Professor Brower. I really love that previous slide. I just want to go back here for a moment because, you know, we speak about this experience in life as being a continuum, and another word is a spectrum. And all human beings can place themselves on somewhere on the spectrum. You can put it all on one line if you'd like to, but it's great to have it split out. And, you know, if we go back in the heterosexual world, you know, examples of how people kind of move across the spectrum are, you know, for young girls who are acting more boyish than they are girlish, if you will, they're called tomboys, right? Or you've got men who are acting more feminine. They express themselves more in a feminine way, and there's a term metrosexual, or you know, so we're finding that we've sort of worked with this continuum and the spectrum for years and years and years, and now we're really starting to give some terms and give some meaning to those terms, which really moves us into language. And language is extremely affirming, and in our roles as judicial officers and as partners in the community that support individuals coming through our courts, we're very cognizant of how affirming that language can be, simply by noticing times when it's disaffirming or denigrating. So we need to look at how we're using our terminology and what the correct terminology may be. And unfortunately, oh, there we go, I just lost my slide viewing, but I'm back. So talking about the language in this area, the term trans or transgender, it's all very important. It aids in not only affirming an individual, but it adds to credibility. It sends a message that the court is sensitive and is accepting of each individual that comes through its door. And critically so, it's a demonstration that we're practicing trauma awareness and being trauma informed in how we're working with individuals that come before us. The transgender, first of all, there's no such term as transgendered. We see that come up frequently. It's an adjective, it's not a noun. But people who identify, have a gender identity and a gender expression that may be different from the gender marker or the sex that was assigned to them at birth, and that's the definition we can work with for transgender. But again, really it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about this spectrum. So not everyone who is transgender identifies as transgender. And again, think about the spectrum and how we express ourselves in the world and how we may identify ourselves in the world, and how others may identify us is where we've got to be the most sensitive. For example, one could have a gender identity of female, but their gender expression is male. So understanding the terms, and there's really quite a glossary out there that judicial officers in our court should be aware of. when reading and addressing our LGBTQ community, understanding what the correct terminology is, and communicating in a way that's respectful and affirming at the same time is critically important. We'll give you some examples a little bit later in our presentation of how this may actually play out, the words you may choose to use in your courtroom so that you can see it as an example for you to use. I think at this time we want to have an opportunity to address any questions about what we've shared with you about our spectrum, our continuum, and also about language and terms.
So I see someone is typing. I'm going to put up the next slide because it's actually mostly photographs. So we can think about that and if people have questions, that's great. So I'd like you to take a look at the photographs. And one of the things that sometimes judges say, or people who work in this area say is, well, I've never actually had anybody who's transgender in my courtroom. And the truth is, if you look at the photographs, all of whom are transgender folks, you may not know it. And I'd like to actually talk a brief moment about the word passing, right? So as a term, passing is actually somewhat problematic in the sense that it says, it makes the idea that what your gender is inauthentic, that somehow you are passing as something else. And so that's a term that I think in terms of ways to express yourself or ways to express yourself around transgender people, that's a term I would avoid, certainly. But it's also true that not all, as Judge Berns mentioned, not all transgender people identify as transgender. They may identify simply as I'm a man or I'm a woman. And so that if you ask people about transgender identity, some people might respond and some people might respond differently than you might think. In addition, as we talked about before, gender identity is separate from gender expression. And so that when we're thinking about this, right, you remember that someone who is transgender doesn't always need to express that in a particular way. You can have a transgender woman, for example, who dresses in a masculine fashion or in a feminine fashion or somewhere in between, just like people who are not transgender can dress more masculinely, more femininely, or somewhere in between. In addition, because of safety reasons and other kinds of things, people who are transgender don't always express themselves in a way that is that correlates with that. That may be because of fear of violence or harassment or assault, because this is in fact true, whether we're talking about children like the example there or whether we're actually talking about adults. Particularly, I think it's important for judges to recognize that when people come into court, one of the things that we know about gay and lesbian individuals, and it's true with trans individuals as well, people who are comfortable in other settings, showing up in court is a very different thing, and we're used to it because that's sort of what we do all the time. But remember that for most people, this is an unusual experience, and it can be very, it can take them out of their comfort zone. So then, what do we know about trans people? We know there are approximately 700,000 transgender individuals in the U.S., but that may actually understate things because, of course, there are any number of ways in which people identify. For example, not that this is a particularly important one, but Facebook has, I think, around 50 or 50 plus ways for people to identify themselves in terms of both gender expression and identity. In addition, as we were just talking about, many people don't identify as transgender because of safety or workplace or personal reasons. And as I said, it can be exacerbated by the court system. In terms of what we know from studies of transgender people, discrimination, victimization, poverty, and particularly the use of controlled substances or abuse, etc., is a significant portion of persons who are transgender in terms of their experiences. Workplace harassment, 90%, 4 times more likely to live in poverty, and 16% reported in the National Transgender Discrimination Survey having to work in the underground economy. Now that's actually particularly important for judges and for courts, because the underground economy, what oftentimes that means for transgender people is doing sex work. That means that they enter both the criminal justice system in that way often, and when we're talking about younger transgender folks, the juvenile justice system. And once you're in the system, of course, that can lead to other kinds of issues. In fact, connections with or interactions with police, 1 in 5 or more than 1 in 5 trans individuals who interact with police report harassment, and of course that's higher in communities of color, and the intersection of other minority identities with trans identity is one that we should be aware of. We have underreporting, and that is almost half reported being uncomfortable seeking police assistance. And when we think about the underreporting that already exists for domestic violence, this just makes that stronger. We have 16% of individuals who've been in jail and they report being physically assaulted, and 15% report being sexually assaulted. I see this question in terms of the underground economy. Let me just go back for a minute. It's 16% are reporting working in the underground economy. All right, so I may have misspoken, but it's 16%. All right. So then, lastly, we have issues about suicide, and I think, Judge Berns, this is you.
Yes, thank you. You know, not surprisingly, when we look at those numbers, and by the way, I'm really glad it's not 60% having to work in the underground economy, but not surprisingly, and most tragically, a significant number of trans individuals have attempted suicide. And really understanding this reality for so many people is absolutely critical to everything that we do in our courts and how we act as judicial officers. Many of you have done a lot of training on domestic violence and understand the importance of context in assessing domestic violence and approaching individuals and families who have experienced this. And this is true here in this particular instance, to understand the context. You know, when we look at numbers like, you know, 41%, 51%, 61% of these trans people who have attempted suicide, I mean, those are huge numbers. And it's very, very concerning. Like I said initially, it's not surprising when they're experiencing the kind of stigmatism in not only in the community, but in the systems within which they get involved voluntarily or involuntarily. If we look at suicide in particular across the LGBTQ population, as well as the overall population, this will give you some perspective on how to really contextualize this reality for a lot of trans folks. So we see the numbers over that 40% mark, and then we look at LGBT individuals, lesbians, gay, or bisexuals. We drop down to at least a half of those numbers, and the overall population is below the 5% marker. So, you know, in looking at the LGBTQ numbers, there are always two that are shocking to me over and over, and one is the trans suicide rates, and the other is our homeless youth that are LGBTQ, and that's always been sort of a tragic reality. So, again, looking at the context, understanding how important that is, there's a good chance you can almost count on the fact that when you have a trans survivor come into your courtroom, they are likely to have been homeless or impoverished, certainly likely to have been discriminated against or harassed in school or in the workplace and other areas in their community. They're uncomfortable seeking help, reaching out to law enforcement based on some of what Professor Brower was sharing with us earlier in terms of police support and response, and they have more likely than not attempted suicide before. And so that is, it really just gives me shivers every time I go through this, that it's something I have to be so mindful of when I have individuals come into my courtroom, in particular this community. If we take that context now and overlay that with the domestic violence experience in the LGBTQ community, in particular in the trans community, you already should be getting a sense of you know, the tragic nature of this and how important it is that we are trauma-informed and how important it is that we properly address these issues. When we look at 1 in 5 or 19% of trans individuals experience domestic violence from a family member. So we have everything else happening, and then we've got this overlay. We have minority trans individuals who are experiencing an even higher rate of domestic violence, Native victims at extremely high rates, near 45% or 1 in 2. Transgender individuals are twice as likely to face threats and intimidation, and they're more likely to face the threats and intimidation, harassment, and police violence in terms of being non-responsive and non-supportive and non-educated about this community within intimate partner violence.
So then I want to mention one other thing, is that we've been talking about violence, but of course violence can be homicide as well, and the significant number of transgender homicides are domestic violence related. And you have this little quote about a transgender homicide victim, Amber Moore, who had been shot 3 times before, but she wasn't comfortable going to the police the first 2 times. And we were talking about underreporting, but here it is brought down to a particular individual. Before we take questions, again, I'd like to mention something which sort of goes to the context in which transgender individuals find themselves in terms of legal situations. As you're no doubt aware, there have been a number of what are called bathroom bills, bills about where transgender people can go to the restroom, and sort of the hostility which turns schools or other places of public accommodations, including the courts, into places that are even more hostile for a transgender person in terms of dealing with this situation, is part of what causes the disengagement that we sometimes see. Disengagement from systems, the health care system, the court system, the justice system, for youth, the school system, and these bills and the sort of controversy just make that worse in that sense. So if there are questions, we'd love to take them now, and otherwise we'll move to tactics of abuse. No question so far. Why don't we talk about tactics of abuse in transgender domestic violence?
Excellent. So I think many of you are familiar with the power and control wheel, and there's a version of that which I find to be extremely helpful in giving examples of how we see domestic violence show up in the LGBT community and in particular in the trans community. So I'll just refer you to this as a great reference tool. It gives you some more vocabulary and an opportunity to get yourself educated on some of the different language that is used there. But where I'd like to spend the time is really talking about the different tactics of abuse. And while it's true that domestic violence is as prevalent in the LGBT community as it is in the heterosexual community, the tactics of abuse can be very different, and it's important that we educate ourselves and become aware of what those tactics are. Here's some examples of the emotional abuse that, coupled with physical abuse, economic abuse, is really very effective at beating somebody down in all respects. Calling the victim an it or anything other than the victim's preferred pronoun, really failing to recognize that individual as a human being, how they're showing up in the world, making fun of how a trans person's body looks and how it does or it doesn't match their identity, accusing the trans person of not being a real man or a real woman. And this is a very, very powerful tactic from DV perpetrators across the spectrum. Ridiculing someone's gender identity and sexual orientation, using slurs, offensive pronouns, or insults, and similarly taking advantage of that individual's expression or identification and having a perpetrator who may be more experienced than a victim in the LGBTQ world, indicating, well, this is how it's supposed to be. You're going to do this, or you're going to be this way. So there's a lot of manipulation that can come into play as well. Hiding or throwing away clothes or items that a trans person uses so that their body and their gender identity can match. This is, again, very, very concerning type of violence committed against a trans individual. Calling body parts by terms that the abuser knows the trans survivor doesn't like. All of that extremely concerning and very effective in beating someone down and disabling them from their own positive affirmations.
So following up on that, there are medical issues, both in terms of hormones or treatment and medical or surgical treatments, which can be used and spun around as part of a tactic of abuse. So that denying the survivor access to the medical treatment or hormones that are necessary, or hiding or discarding the medication, etc., can not only cause medical issues but psychological and psychiatric issues. Oftentimes hormone replacement, for example, is needed every day in order to maintain a sufficient level within the body, and so that the threat or the actual removing of that medication is very significant. In addition, we can talk about sexual abuse. Obviously, sexual abuse exists in the non-trans DV way as well. What's interesting here or important here to think about is this idea that sex, gender, power, and control, they're all linked, of course, and that 50% or approximately 50% of trans individuals will experience this sexual violence during their lifetime. Given the sort of underreporting that happens in DV generally and then that happens within the trans community, both for health care and when we're talking about the justice system. Given that background, when people come to your courtroom, the question is, you have an uphill battle in front of you for making people believe that the legal system, and the courts in particular, will actually see and hear them appropriately. And so that's something to keep in mind, that when this happens, when people show up in your courtroom, they're already in a situation in which they may be mistrustful of you and your court. Lastly, in terms of social abuse, so we were talking about that before, the idea of threatening to out a victim to family, friends, coworkers, etc. Forbidding the trans person, on the flip side, from revealing that they're transgender, if we're talking about issues that would allow them to have a support community, both support from DV, but also support from within the transgender community. And there is a dynamic that sometimes happens where the abuser blames the victim and says, look, if you do this, this will make the trans community or the LGBTQ community look bad by coming forward with that abuse. In addition, that leads to the idea of isolation, right? Because trans identity is socially in a difficult position for lots of people, it makes survivors of this abuse easier to isolate. And we have a quote from Laverne Cox, a transgender actress. Trans identity is stigmatized within the LGBT community. And in fact, we talked about this before, so here is this by a quote as well. The idea that we're discrediting the community to say that this abuse happens. After all this work we're doing, we don't want to attach domestic violence to it. But of course, that shaming, that sort of social isolation means you don't get help from the very communities that you need to be getting help from, families, partners, religious groups, and of course the LGBT community itself. So, what other things are particularly effective against transgender survivors? And we can look at this in terms of specific abusive tactics, right? They tend to relate to either gender identity or gender expression, at least many of them do, saying that someone is not a real man or a real woman, removing, hiding, or destroying medication, right? That goes to issues of expression and your ability to maintain a consistent identity. Refusing or ceasing to spend money on transition-related health care, right? We already talked about at the bottom, referring to the partner as it, or talking about body parts in a particular way, or assaulting the body parts that have been affected by surgery. And then, of course, damaging to the community and outing, right? All of these are ways of dealing with particularly targeting the gender identity and gender expression aspect. So we have questions now. And there was a question that was raised earlier that I want to get to. So the question was, should we be talking about the bathroom issue and other issues similar to that as gender expression issues rather than identity? And it seems, so it's a very good question, and it seems to me that, in fact, we need to separate those two things. The bathroom bills themselves, which talk about people need to go to the restroom or shower facilities, etc., that are consistent with the gender that an individual was assigned at birth, that has nothing to do necessarily with the expression, how someone, whether someone's in a dress or whether someone wears pants or whatever, someone wears a beard. It has to do with how you identify yourself. So to the extent that it's targeting people in terms of their gender identity, then it seems to me it's a gender identity issue. There is a separate question, though, about people who are gender nonconforming, that is to say, regardless of whether they're actually trans or not. Some people have a gender expression which doesn't conform to stereotypes or traditional gender expression in that way. And so that if people are being attacked or forbidden from going to restrooms or being made to feel uncomfortable in a particular restroom, even though both their biology and identity may be consistent with the restroom they're using. So, for example, you have a woman who is a biological female in terms of assigned that at birth, as well as who identifies as a woman, but who may be dressed in a masculine fashion. If she's having troubles in restrooms, that's a gender expression issue, it seems to me, rather than identity. So, depending on what we're talking about there.
Yeah, and I think also that, the expression is obviously very subjective, and it can mean something to someone who is expressing themselves in a manner, and it can mean something to someone who's, observing that or witnessing that. The whole idea around gender identity really places a positive power in that person's own identification. How are they identifying themselves? And, to even open our minds and our hearts to the extent that we can allow someone to identify in a manner that doesn't necessarily match how they're looking or what their gender marker is really a comment on how we're evolving across the planet. I just want to share, going back to our suicide context, that when in looking at all of the legislation that's coming around in certain states around anti-trans bills being introduced, there are numbers and statistics out now that are saying that restrictions in how a trans youth in schools can use a restroom is directly correlated to a high suicide rate. So here's an example of where we can actually see that play out, and some of the, I would hope, unintended, but certainly negative consequences of behavior.
And lastly, there is one other thing. So we were talking about tactics of abuse, and there is a comment which mentions a tactic of abuse which is similar to what we've mentioned, but I think is worth talking about directly, is that one tactic of abuse is highlighting what a trans person's body cannot biologically do, like menstruation or production of facial hair or things, childbirth, things of that nature. And that goes along with targeting the gender identity aspect of this. Lastly, we have one question about unisex restrooms. Unisex restrooms, so I think we need to think about whether unisex restrooms are possible in this society or whether they're preferable, but also want to make sure that we're not segregating the trans person, right? So if they're the only one that has to use a special restroom, that itself can be sort of problematic. All right, so why don't we continue with transgender litigants in the courtroom, and we'll catch up on other questions at the next break.
All right, so a lot of our discussion around understanding who comprises the trans community, how they're expressing, identifying themselves, the context, and the language now brings us to a point where we can look from the bench perspective into what's happening in our courtroom and hopefully give you some practical tools to consider using, at least to have available to you. So the first really has to do with affirmations and understanding how someone really would like to be referred to. I mean, commonly we have greetings in our courtroom, whether you do an overall greeting and introductory statement about a calendar that you might be presiding over, or when each case comes before you, there's a greeting. And so really being mindful to use preferred pronouns, and if you don't know, then you need to ask. You shouldn't assume, and again, how you ask is something you have to be very sensitive to doing. And we'll give you, again, some examples as you go through, or as we go through this, so that you're not putting your foot in your mouth unintentionally. preferred names, and making sure that our court documentation is reflecting the names that are consistent with a survivor's identity or expressions. The name that they were given at birth may be very different from the name that they're actually using in the world. So if there is an issue about the court's ability to do that, then there needs to be some explanation and some sensitivity around that. So using preferred names, discussing the details of that off the record, and explaining why to a litigant why the court is using a specific name. I mean, it's very possible on a name change, for example, if you have a trans individual in your courtroom and you go from Mary Smith to Joseph Ray, you, instead of calling the matter of Mary Smith when you want to be sensitive to the fact that you actually have an individual identifying as Joseph Ray in your courtroom, you can say the matter of Smith, and that takes that whole gender component out as an example. So in considering how we're acknowledging individuals and how certainly our court staff is doing that, we have to be mindful of the Model Code of Judicial Conduct, avoiding circumstances where bias and prejudice and harassment is at play. And Rule 2.3 gives us very clear direction that a judge shall require lawyers to refrain from manifesting bias. And that actually extends out not just to lawyers, but it extends out to our own use, and it extends out to court staff. And that's really important to be mindful of. As I promised, here's an example that you can use when you're trying to make a decision about how to properly address somebody. You can either have a sidebar. In this example, I'm saying, good morning, my name is Judge Berns. I want to make sure I address you by your preferred name and pronoun. Is there a preferred name you would like the court to use today? And what's your preferred pronoun? Thank you. It's important to the court that all parties are made to feel heard and respected. And that's the extent of my comments. If I am presiding over a calendar, I may also explain that I'll be inquiring of each individual as they come forward as to their preferred name and pronoun, so that I'm not just doing that with one or two people in particular when I have a courtroom full of other people. So being careful that I'm uniform in how I'm applying my procedures to ensure that I'm sensitive to how someone is appearing and coming forward in the courtroom.
So
really,
that,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Professor.
So that brings us to sort of the flip side of it. Not only should you be asking certain questions sometimes, but you want to avoid questions that really aren't relevant to the case, that are specific to the individual, or that elicit information the individual may be uncomfortable or may be inappropriate to ask. So that, and in particular, there are a couple questions that you should avoid if possible. Sort of, what's your real name, which makes it sound, of course, that the individual is, once again, not authentic. I would have never known you're transgender, whether or not you look so pretty. That's the kind of thing that, once again, the whole idea of passing raises those issues. And then the one that I've always heard as, are you having the operation or the surgery, or have you had the surgery, right? These are, asking about someone's genitals, we would almost, I can't imagine that we would think that that's appropriate in another context. Is equally inappropriate in this one. And we want to be careful also about soliciting questions in open court when the domestic violence survivor's family are present, as in other cases, notably child welfare, but other ones, the survivor may not be on best terms with family members. Indeed, the transgender discrimination survey shows that very frequently transitioning causes a big break with the family. And so that you can use the sidebar and chambers to get a feel for what needs and fears the survivors had, and that you can do that without getting into substantive issues which would raise other questions in court. You can see there's the model code has a section that could be used in that context. And let me give you an example, just like Judge Berns did. Hello, Ms. Blake. My name is Judge Brower, and I want to make sure you feel as safe as possible while you're here in court. Is there anything we can do to make you feel more comfortable while you're waiting for your case to be called, for an example of things? So I'll pass it to Judge Berns.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So, again, looking at context and domestic violence and how we're responding to individuals that are showing up in our courtroom. And in particular, if we look at our calendars and addressing our protection order requests, this is where I see this come in very commonly, because we're typically having two individuals coming in versus a criminal action where we might have the state there and we may not have a victim present before the court. But in these settings, it's very common and easy, relatively easy for abusers to make the violence look mutual. And it may be easy for them to do that, but it's an oversimplification of what's really happening. It's not mutual. And if one of the parties has exhibited that pattern of abusive behavior over another, then again, you can refer back to your power and control will. You're going to see that come around in using some very different and unique tactics that you need to be aware of. Trans survivors may use violence in that sense for a range of reasons, including surviving the abuse. So be careful about reactive violence, self-defense, and this all is, getting back to your basic understanding of DV dynamics. And nothing's different when we're looking at the LGBTQ community in that regard. Be careful about how you're using a survivor's, or for that matter a batterer's, non-DV criminal history. Looking at that history and making some assumptions is very, very dangerous. Again, you've got to put it all into the context. So understanding that these trans individuals have come out of and walking into a court environment, coming out of a very hostile environment, and being in fear of experiencing that hostile environment in your courtroom is going to create a significant amount of apprehension. So be trauma sensitive. And aware of some of that information that we shared with you about the experiences that trans individuals have by the time they even get to your courtroom. One idea to be mindful of as well is to consider monetary sanctions, knowing that trans individuals are much more likely to have lower income and have been homeless, and consider ordering transportation assistance, which may include getting secured rides or bus passes. And for batterers, consider indigent enrollment if you have that available in your jurisdiction, and if it's a part of your required court programs as well. When we look at victim services, it's also important to be mindful of what's going to work for a trans individual, deferring to what they feel comfortable receiving and participating. And so don't refer a trans survivor to a group without asking that individual what's going to work for them. And this is particularly important if you have, for example, in a sentencing where you may not have that victim present. Ensure that your court orders really emphasize that there needs to be meaningful and appropriate referral. It can be sensitive referral, but certainly appropriate given the victim's comfort in participation and receiving support. Be careful asking that survivor directly in open court, again, for all sorts of different reasons, not the least of which is outing an individual in one manner or another, that you don't want to be the individual doing that from the bench. It might be more appropriate, and it's certainly an easier route for you to ask a victim advocate to inquire, or even if that victim advocate is aware and may have had that conversation with the victim survivor. Be careful about religious or faith-based programs, because at this point many are hostile towards trans litigants. They don't allow medication, they don't support services, they really don't acknowledge and affirm someone's identity and expression. And so a lot has to do with you getting to know your community and the services that are in your community, and if those services are sensitive to trans individuals in particular, but also to the LGBTQ community in general.
Okay, so I'd like to also talk about something that we haven't really much talked about, that is to say trans people as batterers or abusers, right? I mean, because that's also, of course, possible. And when we were talking about referrals are, of course, important when we're talking about batterer intervention programs. You, of course, have to think about what's meaningful and what's going to work for a trans abuser as well. One point that we've talked about, but it comes up here again, is this idea of mutual battering or mutual orders. There's a significant danger of mischaracterizing the victim as a batterer and sending them to one of these programs, which of course is a problem anyway. But independently, of course, then you have to think about what is the program that you're going to send somebody to. And so that let's focus on actually sentencing abusers or referring abusers to the program. Remember that, of course, because they're trans doesn't make them the other sex, so that you would not want to send a female trans batterer to a heterosexual male batterer's intervention program for a number of reasons. You're sending the person to the wrong place, but also you want to be careful about sending trans people to programs that are designed for heterosexual abuse, because the dynamics are different and it may not be an appropriate treatment facility. If we're talking about that, by the way, you can go to these programs, and in fact you probably should have an idea of what these programs are like, particularly in terms of how sensitive they are to trans individuals, to gender identity and gender expression questions. And it would be a good practice, of course, to know, period, what you're doing. And so that's one of the things that you can do in terms of preparing yourself in advance for these issues. So I think, Judge Berns, this is you.
Oh, thank you. So when we get into looking at crafting effective protection orders, we're considering the victim's needs, we're considering batterer or abuser issues, and we're really looking at proper safety provisions that we want to keep in place. Again, just basic provisions within the context of this kind of abuse in this community is keeping individuals from outing other individuals in any manner, and putting proper language in that prevents someone from disclosing information about someone's sexual orientation or their identity or any information about that. Ensuring that survivor has access to health care and medication is absolutely critical for trans individuals. They may be dependent entirely on their partner abusers' health insurance for their own care, and that's something that can easily be canceled without having provisions in there to prevent that, at least having them held accountable if that does occur. And I think Professor Brower spoke a little bit about this idea of assigning, if you have sex-segregated or sex-specific, gender-segregated, gender-specific programs, you really need to look at the identity of an individual that's coming into those programs as a marker for participating in that.
Okay, so I want to just sort of make sure that we have the bottom line here. And that the bottom line is this, is that it's important to affirm the abuse survivor's gender and chosen gender expression identity. That, of course, is crucial in these kinds of cases. Similar to other DV cases, you want to be sensitive to the trauma, both the trauma that you would ordinarily recognize in domestic violence and the particular kinds of abuse that happens in these situations. As always, you want to remember the context when looking at the violence and looking at the things that take place. And lastly, as we ended with, talk about the idea of tailoring referrals to make sure that they are meaningful for the individuals involved. We have a series of resources for you. I'm not going to go through them, obviously, and there's 3 slides worth for that. But what I'd like to do is take a little time to make sure that we've dealt with questions that people have. So why don't we do that, and then we'll close. Oh, I see.
Professor Brower, we did have this is Kelly Runner-Singer from National Council. We did have a question from one guest who indicated, from a legal standpoint, how do you define accommodation? In a school setting, there's often an argument that allowing use of a private restroom is an accommodation, but this participant suggested that an accommodation is really something provided for someone else. In this case, the student is merely accessing a restroom independently. And I would just say, is there a way you can tie that into domestic violence stigmatization or help seeking?
Well, so the idea of an accommodation in some sense is that you're doing something special for someone. But I think in many ways what we're talking about is that it's not the individual who's special. All of us are individuals. We all have individual needs. But rather it's the system recognizing that people have different needs and that therefore different kinds of things need to be done in terms of what is respectful treatment. You need to contextualize what's going on in the particular case, etc. And I wouldn't view that as an accommodation. I would view that as simply a recognition that different situations call for different responses. And this is one that calls for a particular series of responses, or at least the judge should be thinking about, is this something that's different? Do I need to do something different here? Am I acting in an appropriate way? I guess I would say that. So I see, I want to make sure people know this. I see in the chat box that the resources in the PowerPoint are available for download in the resources box. And so that if you're interested in those resource lists and other things, make sure that you take it so that you have that for you. Are there other questions?
Professor Brower, this is Kelly Runner-Singer from National Council. I would just let everyone know that if you're interested in replicating this training in your own curriculum, in your own jurisdiction, please let me know. We're going to be sending out a survey which will have that information on it. So if you'd like to conduct this training in a multidisciplinary setting in your own community, we can make that happen. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges is the comprehensive technical assistance provided to judges on domestic violence, and we also operate the Resource Center out here on domestic violence, child protection, and custody, which means we can back you up with curriculum and instructional support if you need it. And other than that, I would just let our faculty wrap up.
Well, go ahead, Elizabeth, please.
I just wanted to thank everybody for calling in and participating. I hope the information has been helpful. Hope it's given you some things to think about and maybe a commitment to contemplate not only what is available in your community for the trans community, but also our LGBTQ members, but also how you're conducting yourself in your courtroom and what's happening with your court personnel and court staff. So we hope it's been really helpful information, and thank you for calling in.
And I would just like to say thank you as well, and I echo what Judge Berns was talking about. I appreciate everyone's participation here today.